starts noon. So Pat, I will pass it to you to get us started.
Great, thank you, Chell, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pat Wilds. I'm the director of the Government Law Center here at Albany Law School. GLC, as we know it affectionately, has been around for well over 40 years. We analyze, educate, and drive conversations on pressing issues in front of state and local governments and prepare the next generation of government lawyers and leaders here in New York and beyond. On behalf of the GLC and the law school generally, thank you for joining us for this year's second program, part of our annual Warren M. Anderson Legislative Series. Taking place monthly between February and May, the Anderson Series programs focus on major legal and policy issues facing New York State government every spring. The series is named after a really acclaimed alumni of the law school, Warren M. Anderson, class of 1940, who served in the New York State Senate for 36 years, worked with 6 different governors, and he was the longest serving majority leader of the Senate, holding that position from 1973 to 1988. The goal of these programs is really to explain and promote dialogue about current and proposed law and policy, rather than to advocate for a particular policy or course of action. I wanted to also acknowledge before we get going and say thank you to our generous sponsor of the Anderson Series, a contribution made in the memory of Sharon P. O'Connor, Esquire, Albany Law School class of 1979. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to the 19th President and Dean of Albany Law School, Cinnamon Carlarne, who will be moderating today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Much appreciated. Really happy to be here and be part of this program. So we're talking about climate change today. Flooding, drought, extreme heat, hurricanes. The era of global climate change is really upon us. Upon the release of the most recent IPCC report, UN Secretary Antonio Guterres declared, "I've seen many reports, but nothing like the new IPCC climate report, an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership." So, put simply, we're living in a world that's really defined by climate change. Climate change pervades every aspect of contemporary life, but it's also a persistent current through not just our lives, but increasingly throughout the law. Now, that being said, we know that the legal landscape around climate change is both complex and ultimately failing to meet the challenge at hand, especially at the federal level, giving our continuing lack of climate change legislation and just the kind of the fluctuations in executive and regulatory strategies. And this, of course, is what makes state efforts to so important, and particularly the efforts of states such as New York, who've taken a leadership role in developing climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency strategies. And this is the focus of our discussion today. What is New York's approach to addressing climate change? How has it evolved? How are we doing in terms of implementing law and achieving goals? And how should we be thinking about New York climate law and the shifting legal and regulatory environment in which we find ourselves? And we have 4 fantastic experts who are here today to share their insights into the evolving state of New York's climate agenda. And so our 4 panelists who are here today include Professor Michael Gerard, who's the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School. We have Rory Christian, who's the chair and the CEO of the New York State Public Service Commission. We have John Binder, who's the Deputy Commissioner for Climate Change, Air Resources, and Energy at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And then we have Caitlin Stephen, who is the Bureau Chief for Climate, Air, and Energy at the Office of General Counsel at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So you couldn't imagine 4 better people to help us engage with this question of what's New York doing, how are we doing, what's the state of things, and how should we expect that to change over time. So let's dive in. John, can you get us started by briefly explaining New York State's climate policy and just share any insights you might have into the way it really helps position New York as a leader in U.S. climate policy?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dean Carlarne, and thanks to the whole Albany Law School team for having me on this panel today. It's a great panel. It's exciting to be talking about this really important topic. And when it does come to climate policy, we really are in interesting and I guess we can say exciting times. We have the action that the state is taking to really remain a leader with respect to U.S. climate policy. But as the Dean mentioned, we also have what we're seeing really on what feels like a nonstop basis from the federal government. And I know we'll hear more about some of those federal issues later. But I want to start by just giving a very, very brief overview of some of the key climate policies in the state and highlight a few aspects of our state's climate policy and how that does really position us as leaders. I think we can't have this conversation without discussing our state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or Climate Act. This is really the statute that sets us on this path. It sets a goal for net zero emissions in the entire economy by 2050, and it requires statewide greenhouse gas emission reductions of 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. So these are in statute, and these statutory targets really do put us at the forefront nationally, and even more so because of the greenhouse gas accounting methodology that is utilized in the Act, which actually counts some emissions that are associated with imported fossil fuel as part of our New York State total. Obviously, these targets are by no means easy to achieve, but believe it or not, and I think this sometimes gets forgotten, believe it or not, we've actually made comparable progress with reducing other air pollutant emissions. Certainly, it's not an apples to apples comparison, and reducing climate-related emissions presents its own challenges. But really, thanks to decades of policies and regulations by the DEC, tons of work by incredible staff at the agency here, and work by regulated entities to respond, we've actually seen significant reductions since 2000, on the order of 90% in particulate matter emissions, 98% in sulfur dioxide, and I could go on. And we obviously have more work to do to achieve this kind of progress as a state for greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions that cause climate change. But it shows that this kind of progress is achievable. And really, we've already taken a variety of actions to help us get there. So I'll just briefly mention a few before we kind of move on to the next speaker. One is our longstanding participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is a multi-state cap and invest program to reduce emissions from the power sector. And that's a program that we're hoping to advance further in the near future. It also includes our adoption of vehicle emission regulations that help to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. That includes the state's adoptions of programs like the Advanced Clean Trucks regulations and Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulations. So with these regulations, along with statutory directives for zero emission vehicles, these are really helping us to drive emission reductions from the transportation sector. Recently, at the end of 2024, we adopted a couple of regulations that help us reduce sulfur hexafluoride and hydrofluorocarbons. These are among the most potent climate emissions. Just to give you a sense, 1 ton of emissions of something like SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, is equivalent to emitting over 20,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So these are some examples of regulatory actions that we have taken to help implement the Climate Act. In addition to those regulatory actions, we're also charged with addressing climate change as part of our individual permitting decisions. We do that through something called Section 7 of the Climate Act, and I think Caitlin will probably touch upon that a little bit later. The law of the Climate Act also makes the state a leader through some of its critical provisions that address disproportionate burdens on disadvantaged communities, because we know these are areas that have long suffered impacts from pollution and climate change. So I could certainly go on, but these are just a few of the ways that New York remains a leader on climate policy as we continue to implement the Climate Act. And I know that, as the Dean said, this work is going to become just even more important given what we are seeing, and again, on a daily basis, it feels like, from the federal administration. But I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I appreciate both the overview of the landscape, but also the reminder about how much we actually have been able to achieve with our environmental laws that we've had in place since 1970. I mean, the reductions are significant. And so it's a reminder that we've done good work in this space and we can continue to do so. Caitlin and Rory, I'll ask to direct the next question to you. And what I'd like to do is ask if you could each briefly describe kind of what you see as the state of New York's climate progress to date. So what are some of the kind of the greatest successes, but also some of the greatest challenges in meeting those goals, implementing the laws that we have, including both legal and perhaps extra legal actions. Rory, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you, Dean. I think the biggest success, John did a great job of highlighting that, we are building from a history and a track record of successful programs to reduce those local criteria emissions, PM 2.5, SOx, NOx, et cetera. And we've accomplished something that I think many people thought was impossible when those policies were first enacted. So building off of that tremendous success, we're moving forward with an even greater challenge, a challenge of decarbonizing our grid. And I look at the CLCPA, I look at the mandates, And achieving that is going to require significant investments in a wide array of areas. We're going to need to make significant amounts of investments in generation to meet our 70 by 30 and beyond goals for zero emissions clean generation within the state. We're going to have to enhance the grid in ways to make sure that that power can get from wherever it's produced to wherever it's needed most. But most importantly, and most often not talked about, is the need to also enable customers and have customers be a greater part of this process than they have in the past. So thinking about electric generation, we've pursued many of our efforts through the Clean Energy Standard, developing land-based and offshore renewable energy resources, as well as battery storage facilities. And we have a number of targets and goals set for each. Now, there have been many headwinds. We'll likely talk more about many of them, everything from the general disruptions from the pandemic affecting society as a whole and supply chains, the further amplification of those issues by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's, now we're talking about higher inflation, higher interest rates that we've not seen at levels in a generation. And any one of these things in isolation is a roadblock, but these are all happening in combination. And I've not even begun to talk about the tariffs and what their impacts will be. So we have significant headwinds. But the beauty of what we are doing here in New York, we're not relying on any one technology, any one approach. It's a multifaceted policy and initiative with the goals of attacking the goal from many different perspectives. So we're going to continue our work to enhance our ability to deploy clean energy. We're also doubling down on our efforts to ensure the grid has the investments it needs to meet our modern needs. We've allocated investments to the utilities to do transmission and distribution build out to the degree not seen in a generation. In fact, many events I attend, people are often amazed to the degree which New York is developing transmission infrastructure. And this is part and parcel through the coordinated grid planning process, an innovative process which is now requiring all our utilities to look ahead to the future collectively and identify transmission and distribution level needs proactively before critical events arise. And then from a enabling consumer perspective, we have a variety of platforms currently being deployed. We have programs that are looking to implement virtual power plants at a local level. We have innovative rate design practices happening throughout the state. One of note in Long Island, time of use pricing is going to be default offering in the not too distant future for all customers there, something that we hope to then deploy to the rest of the state. But again, all of this requires time, coordination, and it all begins with but a single step. But in concert, these various efforts will put us on a path towards achieving our broader goals. And I could go on with many, many others, but I hope that gives a broad enough picture.
That's fantastic. And just the reminder about the essential nature of the grid and how everything kind of emanates from there, and the investment in that we're seeing is so important. Caitlin, over to you with the same question.
Sure. Just to kind of echo what John said earlier, happy to be here. And also just really to Albany Law School, providing a topical CLE that is free is just really amazing. And I'm so happy to see that continue on. So as noted by the Dean and the previous panelists here, New York has historically been a leader on climate change. And I think, as probably most of you, if not everyone on this call is aware at this point, it now is such a critical time for that leadership to not only continue, but hopefully actually step up to be even brighter. This is particularly relevant to, I think, what I see as the largest challenge we're facing at this current moment, just given it would be the federal administration and the path that they are just trying on a daily basis to push this country down, which I would say is the complete opposite of what New York has historically tried to do and will hopefully continue to try to do as we move forward. But before maybe getting just a little bit more into detail into that, just start off on a brighter note on some of what I see as successes. As John kind of laid out at the top, I think the importance and the significance of the CLCPA itself and what that does and sets the state on, not only in terms of obligations, but excuse me, just a path forward and how we need to proceed. And take this state and be a leader and example of prioritizing climate change and just how important that is. So I think, John did a good job laying out kind of some of the general stuff, but I think Section 7 itself is an area where DEC, I think unsurprisingly, given that it is the Department of Environmental Conservation, has really been a leader and seen a lot of successes in implementing that. Just to be clear, it is not only DEC who has obligations under Section 7 too. But as I just mentioned, we've, I think, really been at the front of that as an example. So what does that mean for the implementation? So for maybe some of you who may not be as kind of versed in the environment, energy sphere of New York State, when DEC went to implement this, we had to get some guidance, right? The CLCPA's got some heady goals, it's got some important stuff, but how are we actually going to implement that? So I think two early successes, I think, in that area were probably the promulgation of some of the guidance documents and the policy documents that help guide agency action in order for that to be consistent, as well as for the regulated community to be able to look at those and say, what are the expectations of me? How am I going to step up and do my part to comply with CLCPA? So some of those were finalized by either revision or excuse me, finalized in December of 2022. So that would have been CP 49, and that's climate change and DEC action, and then DAR 21. And CP 49 was really a general kind of look at how the agency handles things. And then DAR 21, you saw the Division of Air Resources itself really taking the front role and how they would specifically be implementing that in their actions. So how does that kind of play out in real time? And this brings me to what I think is probably one of the greatest legal successes maybe in regard to this area. Some of you may be familiar with a facility called Danskammer. So this was a gas-fired power plant who came to the department seeking a Title V air permit. This permit was denied by the department. This was primarily due to the applicant's failure to comply with Section 7.2 of the CLCPA. They challenged that denial both through administrative means as well as through litigation, and just a huge success, I think, for the department and for the CLCPA and how I believe it was intended to be implemented was that a New York Supreme Court upheld that denial. So what did that mean for DEC, and why is this such a big success? That upheld DEC's authority to deny permits pursuant to CLCPA Section 7, and that's huge. So this actually culminated a little bit more recently. Danskammer never perfected its appeal, and in the June of last year, they withdrew that Title V application and therefore ended the administrative process as well. So I really think that really can't be understated. The kind of court's upholding of that authority and jurisdiction and kind of what the CLCP means for DEC actions in that context was just critical, and will, I think, be something that will continue to play a major role in DEC's, kind of conduct in terms of permit applications and implementation of the CLCPA. A couple other things John briefly mentioned, but I think I'll give a little bit more detail in terms of the climate regulations, because one part of the CLCPA implementation may be things like permit decisions and how are we applying Section 7.2, but another huge aspect of that implementation is regulations that are geared towards and putting us on a path further down to get those emissions reductions requirements that John outlined at the top. So he mentioned Part 494 for HFCs and Part 496 for SF6. And what does that mean? What do those regulations mean? Some of you might not be involved in this field. Those sound like big, long chemical names or something. What does that actually look like? So HFCs are, like John indicated, extremely potent greenhouse gases, and you'll often see those in refrigeration and cooling. So those are things that you can potentially be running into every day. You might be at a supermarket and see those. So I think it's also good to sometimes kind of bring where those things kind of might come across your average person's day-to-day life. These are regulations that are going to bring down emissions reductions that the everyday person might not notice, but they will be affected by. And then I know John mentioned how potent these were, but SF6 for Part 496 is actually the most potent greenhouse gas. And you'll see that primarily used in electric power transmission and distribution equipment. So those were two really big regulations that I was really happy to see kind of, actually get out and hit the street and really continue to see New York lead in those areas. And then one that is extremely recent and a big success for I believe the department and the state is just this week, a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting rule was announced by DEC. This was announced actually yesterday. You guys can look forward to seeing the official publication in the state register on April 2nd, and that'll kick off that official official rulemaking steps. So we'll be accepting comments, got to plug this out there until July 1st. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to check out the stuff on the website. There'll be both informational and rulemaking hearings. And, we really welcome participation in those. So I don't want to take up too much time, even though I am a fast talker and it might actually be coming in handy for once in my life. But just real quick, kind of back to the biggest challenge I laid out at the top is, like I said, it's really, in my opinion, the federal administration just right now, as well as the political climate that administration is both helping create and bolster. It's a good time to be in a state like New York because I'm surrounded by people like my fellow panelists who believe in this and know that the misinformation being spread by the federal government isn't going to affect our ability. It's going to affect our ability, but it's not going to affect our drive to address these issues. But what it is going to do and why it is a challenge in a real practical way is it's going to divert resources that this state could be using to further our own goals and mandates. And instead, we're going to have to step in and be a backstop for the federal government. And, there's going to be potentially litigation that's going to take away resources, whether that's the state potentially maybe in partnership, with the Office of the Attorney Generals of other various like-minded states seeking action by the federal government through litigation itself or defending potential litigation that might be bolstered by those actions. So, definitely don't want to forget the progress that I know, Rory and John have both mentioned. If you look at pictures of this state and other states in this country years ago, it looks different. So we don't want to forget that. We don't want to forget those successes, but, the landscape that we are in and the political climate that we are in is going to make this work even more important. And, it's going to make it hard to keep pushing. But that's why, I think a lot of us on this call do these jobs, and hopefully a lot of you guys who are here listening to this panel can engage with.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm also a fast talker, so I really appreciate it, the amount of information. But I appreciate you really kind of laying the groundwork for it. We thought about energy and transmission, and then thinking about, the diversity regulations for the potent greenhouse gases, the new greenhouse gas reporting rule, but also the story of the kind of rule of law at work. You had a statute, you had a regulation, the court upheld it. It's nice to hear those stories. Professor Gerard, we'll turn to you now. Now, kind of given your very deep understanding of all of the ongoing and expected impacts of climate change in New York and elsewhere, can you share with us what you think of as the 3 most important actions that New York could be taking to either limit the negative impacts of climate change or even prepare for those impacts?
Thanks, Dean Carlarne. So I'll start with addressing the vulnerability of the infrastructure systems in the state. Our Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Hurricane Ida in 2021, and other extreme events led to power blackouts and lots of other negative effects. So the electric transmission system, to a greater extent than the electric generation system, which has its own vulnerabilities, the subway system, the commuter rails, the highways and bridges, wastewater treatment, drinking water supply. All of these essential infrastructure systems have vulnerability to the extreme events that we're seeing. One thing that is being done by some of these, but not all, is conducting vulnerability studies. What's the vulnerability of these infrastructure systems to the anticipated climate impacts, all of which we know are going to get worse and are going to get a lot worse because of what the current federal administration is doing. So one of the first companies to undertake this this kind of vulnerability study pursuant to a settlement in a rate case with the Public Service Commission was Con Ed. And so they did a very elaborate vulnerability assessment looking at the latest climate science and are implementing some of the recommendations. Some of the other utilities are doing this, but I think this should be more widespread. We do have an important statute in New York that gets relatively little attention, the Community Risk and Resilience Act of 2014. And I think that full implementation of that is very important. The second item I would mention is heat. Heat is the biggest killer from climate change, at least so far. We have the urban heat island effect, and there are a number of ways to address that through more green space, more urban trees, which also help address flooding, light-colored surfaces, ventilation in buildings. We need to give financial assistance to low-income consumers so that they can buy and operate air conditioners, which are going to become more important in the years to come. Community services for the elderly and the sick who are at home and often are the most likely to die from heat because they're alone and are ignored. So a lot of actions to address the threats of heat. And then a macro issue of flooding in the New York region. For years, the Army Corps of Engineers has been at work on and off on a study called the HATS study, the New York and New Jersey Harbor and Tributaries focus study to look at whether there are large scale, small scale, medium scale infrastructure improvements to try to reduce the flood risk that the whole region faces. It was going on. Trump 1.0 stopped it. It's up again. I don't know whether it's going down again, but it is a multi-decadal, multi-tens of billions of dollar process. But it really has to proceed if we're going to avoid some of the worst kind of flooding that is inevitably going to happen.
Thanks, Professor Gerard. I think, Charles, did you have an announcement that you wanted to make? Oops. I think we were going to have a CLE code in just a moment, but maybe we'll come back to that. But we really appreciate those thoughts and just kind of want to reiterate the heat point and all of the, we've heard a lot about the efforts to kind of create a regulatory regime for controlling climate change and limiting emissions and reporting on it. But there's so much work that needs to be done and can be done, at the local level and the state level to begin to kind of prepare for the impacts of heat, flooding, et cetera. Okay, so
Hi,
now,
sorry about
yeah,
that.
that's okay.
The computer froze over here. For those of you who are attorneys in New York State looking for CLE credit, that's continuing legal education credit, you have one code to put on your CLE affidavit. That one code is visible on your screen. The code is FUND25. That word is FUND, FUND, followed by the numbers 25. That's FUND25 is your code word. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chell. And I should say thank you to Chell for all of the amazing work on this program. But now let's pivot to what's next for climate policy in New York. So we've heard a lot about the foundations, the framework, the good work that's going to be done, but we all know that there's a whole lot that still needs to be done in the challenging environment within which we find ourselves. So John and Rory, maybe we'll start with you here, with the two of you here, and just ask if you could briefly describe what types of regulatory activities or investments are on the horizon and what your thoughts are on those activities and investments. John and then Rory.
Sure, thanks for the question. You heard earlier from me, from Chair Christian, from Caitlin about some of the things we've already done in the state, really to keep the Climate Act at the forefront and what we've already done in the past, but now we want to make sure we maintain that progress. And really, as you pointed out, there are a lot of regulatory related items on the horizon over the next year and more, right? And it's going to be impossible to cover all of them in just a few minutes here. So I think I'd like to just briefly highlight 4 of them, if that works. First, the one that Caitlin already mentioned, right? There's the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting rule that we announced just yesterday. This is going to really help us to further inform actions that we can take to reduce emissions across the state. It's also, I think, notably going to serve as a backstop to some of the action that we are seeing at the federal level, because one of the many things we have heard from the federal government is that they will be potentially reconsidering the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program federally. So, but it's also going to be an important foundation for other programs like Cap and Invest as we continue to move forward with implementing regulatory programs. So I'm excited about that. And as Caitlin said, please submit comments through July 1st. Starting on April 2nd. Second is the Climate Change Superfund, which the governor signed at the end of last year. And the idea here is really polluter pays, and that law is really seeking to recover $75 billion from the largest polluters that are responsible for climate change. Obviously, I'm not going to talk too much further about that because we do have pending litigation, but DEC is charged with implementing that law through regulations and through issuing notices of cost recovery demands to the polluters that are the most responsible for contributing to climate change, and then we would be utilizing those funds for various adaptation and other purposes. The third thing I want to mention is the Community Air Monitoring Initiative. This is an initiative that the DEC undertook under the Climate Act. And really the idea here was requiring the state to look closely at some disadvantaged communities to get a more granular sense of local air pollution impacts, looking at climate change pollution, but also some of the co-pollutant and criteria pollutants that you've heard us discuss today. And so the law said we had to go and look around 4 communities, but we expanded that and we looked at 10 study areas around the state. And that was an effort where cars actually drove block by block at least 20 times over the course of the year and had sensors in the back of them and actually took individual pollution data on a regular basis. And that we've now completed the first phase of that effort. You can go to our website and you can find really cool and interactive story maps where you can actually see on a block by block basis, color coded in terms of where the emissions are coming from, how intense the emissions are. And that's really, really going to be helpful for us to get more information about the second phase of this effort. And the second phase, I think, is going to be even more important because now we're going to be utilizing all of that information that we've collected to help inform future strategies to reduce emissions in disadvantaged communities. And that's going to help us to direct additional regulatory or legislative action that we may need, additional investments that have to go into these communities, really with the idea of focusing these efforts in the communities that need it most and where there is the most impact from these pollutants on disadvantaged communities. So I'm really excited about the second phase of the Community Air Monitoring Initiative. DEC largely collected the data, but now it's really going to be all of the state government, including our partners and other agencies like DOT and the Public Service Commission and others that are really going to be important to make sure that we are actually taking actions to mitigate and address those emissions that we've identified through the Community Air Monitoring Initiative. And then the last thing that I'll mention for now is not exactly focused on climate change, but certainly related to it, and that is the Environmental Justice Citing Law. This is a law that went into effect at the end of December of 2024. And we also have regulations out on the street for public comment right now, I believe through May 7th. And I mention it because I think it really builds on one of the elements that Caitlin was talking about, Section 7 of the Climate Act. There's a provision called Section 7.3 of the Climate Act, which looks at disproportionate burdens on disadvantaged communities as part of the permitting process. What this environmental justice citing law does is really even take that a step further to make sure that we're considering potential disproportionate burdens on disadvantaged communities as part of the existing seeker process, but also as part of our permitting process. And so some of our regulations that are addressing that are out for public comment now. And I think that's going to be another way that the state continues to show how it can be a leader in addressing these issues. So again, probably a lot more things that are coming down the pike that I could highlight, but in the few minutes, I just wanted to focus on those 4. So thanks.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it and appreciate the kind of the link between Professor Gerard's kind of raising up the question of vulnerability assessments and then thinking about the ways in which climate change will be felt very differently in different communities and the need to begin to really understand and address those considerations. Rory, over to you.
Sure, and I too will piggyback off what Professor Gerard closed in on the vulnerability studies. We at the commission, in addition to directing Con Ed to take those investments immediately after Hurricane Sandy, we recognize that there's an increase in not only the severity, but frequency of extreme climate events. And we've been working with the utilities for years and recently directed them to move forward with developing climate resiliency plans. And these plans are far broader than simply what's going to happen with the next storm, but they're a look at everything from construction practices to operational procedures and how those need to evolve and adapt in the face of an evolving and adapting climate. Many of the engineering practices, design policies that we have long incorporated in building and in operating our system were simply based on a time that we cannot expect to continue. Conditions that are evolving at a pace that we can no longer count on to be stable. So we must evolve as the climate evolves. And our resiliency plan efforts are with that goal in mind. And that's going to lead to a number of investments that will not just improve day-to-day reliability, but enhance resiliency of the system overall as these events occur. So that's one high-level systemic improvement that we at the Commission have been leading. Addition to that, we also have an ongoing proceeding, a 0 by 40 proceeding. And this is looking at what kind of emissions-free generation can New York rely on, and also how do we evaluate new technologies as they become mature and become commercially available. We've had a number of discussions concerning the role of hydrogen, and that's an ongoing conversation that we have in multiple parts of our energy system. We've had inquiries about the use of carbon capture and sequestration. All of these and many more things are currently being evaluated as part of that process. And in addition to evaluating the state of the technology and the suitability today, we're putting in a framework for making future evaluations as the technology evolves. Something we definitely are going to need to do given the fast and rapid pace of technological revolution and evolution that we're seeing today. I want to go back and also talk about the coordinated grid planning proceeding. This was not a snapshot in time. And again, the goal of this is to build out our transmission infrastructure to ensure that our grid is strong enough to interconnect with new resources as they become available. And we did this in a multi-step process. Step one, identifying where the need was greatest today and authorizing those investments. We did that several years ago through an order known as the Areas of Concern Order, where aptly named, these were areas where generators were trying to interconnect, but having trouble doing so because of limited transmission capacity. So we've been directing the utilities to make those needed investments to ensure those generators can more easily interconnect. And then we also looked at the distribution level to ensure that resources at the sub-transmission level could connect easily as well. In areas where there's significant economic growth, we can ensure that the infrastructure needed in those areas already identified can be made more expeditiously. And all of this, again, with the goal of helping us achieve our goals more quickly. The investments we needed to make, just making them in a more targeted manner. And we didn't just stop there. We then established a systemic planning process through which in 3-year intervals, we will constantly be looking at a state level rather than utility by utility. What does the state need to meet its goals? Whereas before we would do this through an individual utility rate case by rate case, now we look at this collectively through its own standalone process. And so we see this as a way to expedite the transmission development process, make interconnections more easily, and ultimately hasten our development of resources towards our overall goals. Now, all that said, we're also trying to make sure consumers have access to and the ability to engage in a way that makes sense for them. We know that EV adoption is growing by leaps and bounds, and we've seen year-over-year growth at the state level and significant growth in certain regions where we see the benefits of both state and local support combining to create significant incentive opportunities for people to adopt EVs. Most notably, New York City and their taxi regulations have created a significant increase in the number of electric vehicles there. To support that, we have something called the EV Make Ready Charging Program. And this program effectively helps subsidize the costs of making a site ready for EV charging. So if you imagine you want to charge your EV, you need a certain amount of infrastructure behind your meter that the utility must invest in to get your site ready. That can be fairly significant in cost. And we are subsidizing up to 90% of those costs for publicly available chargers and a little bit less, 50% for private charging. So this is a program we've had in place for some time now, and it's constantly evolving to take into consideration economic realities and market realities as they evolve. And looking at EVs as a microcosm of what's to come, we're also trying to understand how to better control and manage the load of the different areas that individuals are going to be electrifying over time. EVs will displace gasoline. Heat pumps will displace oil and natural gas boilers. So will electric water heaters. And managing that load will be integral towards ensuring the health and well-being of the grid and lowering the needed investments in the grid to make all of that work. So looking at that, we're looking at something called dynamic load management. Some may think of it as virtual power plants. And we're looking at this not just from the utility perspective at the distribution level, but also at the wholesale level through the New York ISO, Independent System Operator. The goal here is by being able to manage that electricity, we can better manage the peak that we need to build our electric system to handle. And this is a fundamental fact of the system. It has to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we design and build it with that goal in mind. If we're going to add load without any restrictions, without any ability to control it, we are effectively increasing that peak and thus driving significantly more investments. So by simultaneously making investments to manage that load while also making the grid more robust, we can control it and better limit not just the emissions from generation needed now as we transition towards a cleaner future, but also lower the cost of building a grid far bigger than it need be, given the level of control we have over the individual users. So these are all areas that are currently receiving significant investments. And the beauty of the dynamic load management approach is this is something that each of us can engage in today, whether you own an EV, a smart appliance, a smart thermostat, all of these technologies that people are adopting on their own without incentives can be used as part of this to not just lower their bill at the individual household level, but to lower system costs at a whole, further compounding the savings. So we see this as an opportunity to enhance affordability across the board, and we're looking to make sure that effort is well known and everybody can adopt it.
That's fantastic. And I love the kind of the frame as we must evolve as the climate evolves, and thinking about all of these different resiliency efforts within that framework. Caitlin, I want to turn to you now. It's an interesting time, right? It's an interesting time, lots of ways at the federal level, but it's also budget time. And so I'm just wondering if you could offer a little bit of insight into kind of some of the climate policy proposals in the governor's proposed budget.
Yeah, sure. No, certainly interesting and very active time up in the state capitol right now. So for any of those executive or legislative staffers who are joining us, we will not fault you if you fall asleep. We know you've had some late nights and some more late ones to come with that, budget deadline looming. So I think really the top one that comes to mind for me is going to be the $1 billion proposal by the governor, and that would come in the form of the Sustainable Future Program in her executive budget this year. So this is going to be $1 billion, or at least as proposed right now, for services and expenses for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects throughout the state. I think it also is critical to kind of look at this in the context, right, of, this $1 billion is going to, I think, be even more critical given the funding freezes and pullbacks we're seeing from the federal level. So even more critical time for this money to be potentially on the table for this state. So what would that $1 billion go to in terms of types of projects and things like that in the current proposal by the executive? So we're talking about things including but not limited to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, that's a critical frontline one. There's so many ways that the state is already doing, and that could use an additional infusion of funding to continue and progress those things perhaps even quicker. And we're going to see also, a huge portion of the state's emissions actually come from buildings. That might not be something that your average person thinks about, but all the systems and stuff that we have going in buildings to kind of keep us comfortable running, the lights on, all of those have a factor to play in our energy use and where that energy comes from. So some of this funding could also be seen towards going to the decarbonization and retrofitting of buildings in order to decrease that kind of sector of emissions. We'll see things hopefully like creating and utilizing renewable energy. Again, this is another critical piece. What we've seen kind of with the increased inflation and costs, I think as Rory discussed earlier, right, coming from COVID and delays that we're still feeling. So more money being infused in those areas. And again, with the federal government basically calling for almost a stop, honestly, and a lot of those, again, crucial funding. And then, some more additional things kind of would be at play too, right? We're talking about advancing clean transportation initiatives, mobile Emissions are another huge portion of emissions that we see in the state and really throughout the country and the world. You're also going to see hopefully building and maintaining and then repairing of thermal energy networks. There's going to be design and construction of new and repair and improvement of green infrastructure. And then, of course, in the governor's proposal and in that language, you'll see a catch-all or somewhat of a catch-all, right? So for the purposes are consistent with the scoping plan. So the scoping plan is a huge kind of master document that came out of the CLCPA, where a bunch of industry experts, state experts, just critical minds in this field came together to really look at what our emissions are, how can we tackle those. So I think that'll be a great kind of outlining of other additional things that this money could then be put for. So as you kind of mentioned, right, we're still in the state itself is still in the negotiation process for that. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out. It was encouraging, right? You did see outside of the executive proposal, the Senate and the Assembly both responded to that and engaged with this proposal with their own. The Senate's clearly, very closely, I believe, mirroring the executive one. And then I think could be particularly interesting in negotiation, right, that we'd see in that is the Assembly did have their own proposal, but they divvy that money up a little bit more specifically. So definitely an exciting time to watch that. I think kind of a couple other things about this money, which is kind of an interesting proposal, right, is that it can be suballocated to any agency or authority. So I obviously have a lot of experience with the DEC, but there are, other agencies and authorities, as Chair Christian, represents on this panel here, as well as many others, NYSERDA. So that's opening it up. And of course, maybe your non-traditional environment and energy agencies could also be taking steps and should be taking steps in this fight against climate change. And then of course, all of this is kind of over in the overarching current landscape that we have from the CLCPA, right? And you'll see in the ECL in section 750117, right, where you'll see that kind of disbursement of funding requirement that the state needs to put no less than 35% with a goal of 40% of funds invested into disadvantaged communities. And this is even more critical when we talk about things like Professor Gerard mentioned, right, extreme heat, who are often the most vulnerable to that, disadvantaged communities. So it'll be great to see that funding continue down that path with those kind of goalposts on it and where it needs to go. And then a little bit maybe out of traditional policy, I did want to note, we did see continued support for a $400 million EPF. And while this might not on its face kind of seem like policy, and again, for those who maybe aren't in this field on a day-to-day, that's the Environmental Protection Fund. And while it might not seem like maybe a big policy move in and of itself, continued support for that level of funding is huge. And if you actually look at a line by line breakup of that fund, you'll see a lot of maybe more niche policy steps being taken or funded or grown in that aspect. We're talking about invasive species funding, land acquisition. You see money going to kind of smaller local governments, right, for certain things that how they can kind of step up and engage in this sphere. And I know firsthand the kind of intense line by line kind of negotiation that goes through. So just wanted to make sure that that's not forgotten, in the shadow of the 1 billion, is that continued support for that is going to be critical. And that money is always sought after, and it never goes to waste. So I think those are probably the top two things that I would highlight today.
Thanks, Caitlin. I think that's both helpful, and it's going to be a nice reminder both about the bigger projects and the the continuing need to do the work that we've been doing for a long time, and also helpful to have an explanation of what EPF means, since environmental law is nothing if not filled with acronyms. All right, so Professor Gerard, I'm going to give you the last question before we try to take an audience question, and it's a big one. All right, so what do you think are the greatest challenges that are posed to New York climate law and our continued evolution, given the Trump administration's stated intent to roll back federal climate and environmental law, and also to very actively promote fossil fuel development? So kind of in this really rapidly changing regulatory environment, do you think New York can remain a leader in climate law and achieve what we want to achieve?
So the regulatory program set up by DEC and Department of Public Service under the CLCPA cover many sectors of the economy, but not all of them. And the CLCPA also does not have its own funding stream. And the $1 billion that Caitlin just talked about is terrific, but it's not nearly far enough. One very important program that would help fill in both of those is the Cap and Invest program. And so DEC and NYSERDA have been working very hard to set it up. They've had a lot of public hearings, done a lot of studies. It's my understanding that it was about to roll out in draft form in January, but unfortunately the governor pulled the plug. She imposed an indefinite pause on the start of the Cap and Invest program. That stoppage led to a lot of public doubt about New York State's actual commitment to moving forward with everything it needs to do on climate change. This was especially disappointing in view of the passage of the Green Amendment to the New York State Constitution in 2021 with a 2-to-1 vote showing overwhelming voter support for action on climate change. The statute, the CLCPA, gave DEC a deadline of January 2024 to issue necessary regulations to achieve the greenhouse gas goals. Obviously, DEC is very late with the cap and invest regulations. I was happy to see the release of the draft greenhouse gas reporting rule yesterday, which is one step in the right direction, but we really need to move forward. It wouldn't surprise me if we see some legal actions taken shortly with respect to the state's failure to go forward with cap and invest. The second thing I would mention, it's been alluded to, is the need for the just massive, utterly massive build out of wind and solar and storage and transmission. Chair Christian talked about the important work that's being done on the transmission side. The technical studies underlying the CLCPA scoping plan looked at about a doubling of the need for generation by 2050 in view of the electrification of vehicles and of buildings and everything else. And it didn't mention the prospect of data centers, which could further add to the load. And we also need to cut back and to a large extent phase out natural gas. But right now, natural gas is by far the largest source of electricity in the state. Wind and solar add up to only 2 or 3%. So we just need a massive build out. The Office of Renewable Energy Siting has really made a lot of progress in moving that forward, but we're still not at nearly the pace we need to be in order to meet the increased electricity load and to phase out natural gas. Now, in terms of the challenges posed by the Trump administration, the one that most concerns me is the motor vehicle emission standards. You know, the state has the goal of just selling zero emission vehicles by 2035, but that's not really in our hands. This is federally preempted, and if they really do, most importantly, wipe out the California waiver, which allows New York State to adopt the very strong standards moving toward electric vehicles from California. That's going to make it very tough to meet that standard. Now, 2035 is still a decade away, but losing 4 years would be a major step backwards. The state also has a lot of procurement ability to buy clean vehicles on its own. Offshore wind is in terrible shape under Trump. Trump doesn't like offshore wind. He says it kills whales. It's not at all clear that it kills whales. The whales seem to be the only species for which Trump has expressed any affection, while he is simultaneously trying to weaken the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. There are some threats to onshore wind if the Federal Aviation Administration does certain things. We don't know if they will. The threats to the Inflation Reduction Act are serious because they're important to a lot of the renewable energy we need. And I hope that the members of the New York congressional delegation from both sides of the aisle press to try to prevent the wholesale repeal of the very important programs under the IRA. So the Trump administration is going to do a lot of damage. New York has the potential to moderate that damage, and I hope that New York lives up to that potential to moderate the damage done by the Trump administration.
Thank you, Professor Gerard. So we only have 5 minutes left. You know, the suite of questions that we're getting around nuclear energy in New York, how to kind of move away from gas, but then a lot of the questions really kind of circle around the impact of federal policies we just talked about, including financial limitations, as Caitlin mentioned. We're going to be kind of diverting resources, but also questions about whether essentially there's state sharing. So states who are working in this space, you know, is there cooperation, is there sharing? Maybe if everybody could just offer like whatever you have, like a 1 minute, any response to any of those questions, or just anything that you want to be sure that this audience hears and has access to. And maybe Caitlin, we'll start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. I think, I think actually collaboration between, particularly, I wish I could say all states, but I think everyone's probably aware that there are states that kind of come together around certain causes because they have like-minded thinking, policies, you know, political leaders, and you know, whatever parties in power. But I think we'll actually see, and what we've seen historically is New York has engaged with, you know, through representation of the Office of Attorney General, right? Whether they are bringing something themselves or whether they're bringing something at the behest of the executive. You'll see them uniting with kind of similar like-minded states on a lot of these issues. So there was discussion, I think brief mention of, right, you know, potentially getting rid of the Clean Air Act waiver that allows California to set heightened standards, and New York has always followed in that suit. So if that were to, you know, continue and stuff, we would see states, I think, you know, that are in agreement with us that this cannot happen, bring that and pool resources, right? So it's not just information sharing. It's not just kind of, quite frankly, sometimes it's commiseration of what the heck is going on. I can't believe it's 2025 and we have someone in the Oval Office that's questioning climate change and how important it is. But it's a pooling of those resources. New York oftentimes takes a leadership role in those, but I have a feeling that we're going to maybe see so many of them that we're going to also need other states that usually are in the front of these things to also lead. So I definitely think we'll continue to see pooling of those resources, and it'll be necessary.
Thanks. Chair Christian.
So I agree with Caitlin completely. You know, I see no reason for New York to abdicate its role, the role long established and hopefully will be held for a long time to come. But the key reality and the sobering reality is it's one thing to move forward with some federal support. It's another thing to move forward with an agnostic federal government. It's an entirely different story to move forward with a federal government that is clearly in opposition to many of the things that we as policymakers, as state officials, are trying to do at the behest of those who, the general public that wants it. So we're in a very challenging environment, and much of what we will be trying to do will be to retain our ability to move forward, and also take steps that can help us leapfrog any obstacles that are there. It's going to be a challenging time. I think we all know that, everybody here, both listening and speaking. But I know my colleagues here on this call and in other agencies, we've risen to the challenge before and will rise to this one as well.
Thank you. John.
Certainly agree with that and with what Caitlin said as well. And I think Professor Gerard was right to point out some of the mobile source rules are some of the most concerning things that we're going to be seeing from the federal government, our Section 177 authority. And I think one of the things that we're going to be looking at is to make sure that we are able to preserve our authority to continue to lead. And so that takes sometimes having to take action to backstop what the federal government is doing. We will continue to do that. Right now, we know that there's a lot of things that have already happened and there's a lot of things in the works, but we also have a series of, I'll say, poorly worded press releases that EPA has issued. And so if they're going to be following the legal process, and you know, understanding that's an if at this point, if they're going to be following the legal process, they still have to go through some additional steps to implement those changes. So we're going to be following those steps, and we're going to be submitting comments in opposition as appropriate. We're going to be taking legal action as appropriate, as Caitlin said. And then if it turns out we have to take regulatory action to backstop, we will do that as well. But certainly in concert with other states, just like we have done so far. But yeah, I think it's a really important part of our jobs under Trump 1.0, and will be even more important now under Trump 2.0.
Thank you. Professor Gerard.
Caitlin quite rightly pointed to Section 7.2 of the CLCPA, which requires every state agency to examine the greenhouse gas implications of all permits and licenses and funding and so forth, and to take action if things will have a negative impact. DEC is certainly doing a lot pursuant to that. Not every agency is. There was an important report last year from New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and New York Renews saying that most of the other state agencies really are not strictly following 7.2, such as the Department of Transportation. So we need the New York is all in a whole of government approach. It shouldn't just be left to DEC and to the Department of Public Service to do that. And so that I hope that going forward, all the other state agencies are also going to carry forth their obligations under the CLCPA and also do everything else that they can to cope with the climate change that is coming, and that in part due to the current Trump administration is just going to get worse.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for really laying out a very comprehensive understanding about what New York's doing, the challenges we face, but also the opportunities, and just for thinking collectively at a moment like this when there's so much need to be thinking across lines and across departments. And so really, this has been a wonderful opportunity to learn and engage. So thank you to each of our 4 panelists. And I want to say a special thank you as well to everybody at the Albany Law School Government Law Center who has been so pivotal in organizing this panel, to Lisa Rivage, to Chell Miller, and to our director, Pat Wilds. Again, thank you everyone for being here, and thanks to our panelists for a really wonderful discussion.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks very much.
Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And thank you. As a reminder, as people leave, please submit your CLE forms to Lisa Rivage via email within 24 hours. Your forms are in one of the many emails you've received from me today. Thank you all.